a lot of you already know Amanda. She started as an archivist, the archivist of the Sacramento Public Library in 2010. She is a graduate of Southern Oregon University. She is also a graduate from the University of Texas at Austin. She has written 2 authoritative books on the history of Sacramento, World War I in the Sacramento Valley and World War II Sacramento. She's also published articles, scholarly articles, on the urban history of Sacramento. And she has recently moved on to another position, but made a huge impact at SPL and within the historic community of Sacramento. So we're just really excited to have Amanda back to present on this very important topic, ever timely, ever crucial. So without further ado, Amanda, I'm going to turn things over to you. Welcome.
Okay, it's exciting, Zooming this.
And also make sure that you unmute. I think you're muted, Amanda.
Am I muted? Oh, okay. I am unmuted. See, I'm fine, right? I'm good. Okay. So, as James said, I'm going to be talking about the Sacramento angle of women's suffrage, mostly from 1870 up to the passage of the 19th Amendment. And before I get into that, I want to share some sources I used so you can see what I'm drawing from. I'm just going to show these here. The first one is Paving the Way, Women's Struggle for Political Equality in California. And this is kind of a series of kind of essays, short essays on various political issues that women were working through right up until pretty much present. Then the other is California Women and Politics from the Gold Rush to the Great Depression. And this is a little bit more topical. So it's also going from 1850s to 1929, really interesting essays on a variety of topics, every area of women's political activism. So we're looking at like temperance movement, moral reform, wartime stuff in the 70s. So that's a pretty broad one. And then I'll mention this because this is not like a nice little general survey. And I just got this from Folsom Library because that's my local library. And so it was available. It was like one of the few books on women's suffrage there. But it's a Jeffrey Ward, Ken Burns thing. So it's pretty accessible, not for ourselves alone. It's a story of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. If you're interested in kind of like a general overview up to circa turn of the century for women's suffrage movement, this is a really fun book, and it's got lots of great historical photos, ephemera, things like that in there. And then I also referred to a great book, Women Trailblazers of California, Pioneers to the Present, and that's a pretty recent book. And that one has just short biographies of prominent women across a variety of topics. And they even have a nice section on women's suffrage. And so kind of looked at that for the general California picture. And of course, I also used very liberally the Sacramento Bee and Sacramento Union. Sacramento Public Library has access from the beginning to present of the Sac Bee Online, keyword searchable, which was, you know, invaluable. And then you can also access Sacramento Union at cdnc.ucr.edu. You didn't have time to write it down, but there it is. You can Google it, and that's up to 1922, which for this topic is plenty, but that's also keyword searchable and freely available online. So there's a lot of free, this is all free resources that I used for this. So again, my presentation is going to cover up to the 19th Amendment. We're celebrating in 2 days the final ratification of the 19th Amendment. That was August 18th, 1920. So this is very timely. And now, of course, Sacramento, California ratified it like a year earlier. but it's still a great time to celebrate this. So I'm going to be talking about the local movement, but I can't really do that without touching on a bit of California in general, especially since it's, you know, the capital of the biggest city in the West, or biggest state in the West. And then I'll also briefly talk about the national movement, just as it informs the local movement. Because at the time, it was all kind of one thing. Everybody was helping everybody out nationally, so it all connects. And then there'll be time for questions at the end, which can take the form of video, audio, chat, whatever you like at the end of this. And I'd be happy to do that. So I'm going to actually attempt PowerPoint sharing here. See how this looks. I'm just going to like start this right up here. And okay, and then I'm going to click. Okay, does that look good for everybody? That's showing, let's see if I get the correct. Okay, is that showing up for everybody? Is that okay? And I have to make sure that I have the PowerPoint. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to do in talking about this, and I got to make sure that I've got a good view of all of you, is paint the picture of what suffrage was like, or what women's political rights were like at the national level as a whole around the time that this whole movement got started. So the most public and prominent kickoff point in history was the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848. And this is a lot of women coming, especially from the Northeast, together to talk about suffrage. And this was the first major event that sort of started that all. And it was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and some other prominent women who went on to kind of lead the suffrage movement for decades to come. And it was a real success in that it got the dialogue going. However, it's important to note that in 1848, that dialogue was mostly about how the idea of women voting was just absurd. So it at least got things going, but it was largely negative at the time, both in terms of like the idea of women voting, and also the women who were pushing for women to vote were kind of vilified and treated as just unnatural at the time. And the reason for this is that suffrage was kind of considered, it was part and parcel of a larger system in which women had almost no political rights at the time. And that was part of coverture, which was a legal doctrine in which if a woman married her husband, all of her legal and civil rights were just subsumed with her husband. So she didn't have any right to property that she had obtained prior to marriage or during marriage. She had no, she couldn't bring in her own income. If she had a job during marriage, all of that money was her husband's. No custody of children. If there was divorce, the custody would automatically go to the husband. So there really wasn't this personhood for a woman upon marriage in terms of her political status. And women in the West did have more freedoms kind of from the beginning, but a lot of that was pretty informal. So you still had at the state level in California, you still have the Constitution saying that only men can vote, and a lot of these laws were in place everywhere. So even though women in the West informally were holding positions and doing things and holding more sway politically, they weren't formally. It just was like in a very informal way. And the question of suffrage was first really talked about, as far as I can tell, in Sacramento in like the 1850s. And it was debated because at the time people did a lot of debates. And every time it was debated by the Sacramento Lyceum and other groups, they all decided that the negative side won, that suffrage was a terrible idea. And this continued for quite a while before the idea of women's suffrage was treated more seriously. So I found this letter, Mark Twain, who later would pen the slogan, "Votes for Women," and was very supportive of women's suffrage later on. He, in April 1867, he had some letters published in the Union, and they were satirical. I don't know like how it's still okay, even if they're satirical, but I'll quote them. He said, quote, "I never want to see women voting and gabbling about politics and electioneering. There is something revolting in the thought. Content yourself with your little feminine trifles, your babies, your benevolent societies, and your knitting, and let your natural bosses do the voting. So this was Mark Twain, 1867, contrasted with Mark Twain, turn of the century, fully in support of the idea of women's suffrage. So what changed things initially and got the movement really going locally was the 15th Amendment and really all of those Reconstruction amendments that are happening around that time. The 15th Amendment gave universal manhood suffrage. So this gives suffrage to former slaves. And I'll read the amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And California did not pass the 15th Amendment. So we were one of only 7 states to not pass the amendment. We did not ratify it. Not because we were concerned so much about African-American residents of California, citizens of California then voting. We were really concerned that 13th, 14th, 15th amendments combined would enable Asian immigrants in California then to gain citizenship and vote. And we were in California, that was a huge worry at the time, from the mid-1800s all the way up into, the 40s really. So they did not like that idea and opposed the vote. And the amendment, the 15th Amendment, was not ratified by California until 1962. So it took a very, very long time. Yeah. And this is the 1870 session of the California Legislature in which a lot of these questions start to be asked. So this is the first time that it was brought before the state assembly to have male stricken from the Constitution as a requirement for voting in California. And it received 47 votes against and 23 in favor, which it's important to note that historically, as these votes went through, that's still 1/3 of legislators supporting women's suffrage in 1870. So it wasn't a black or white thing that absolutely everybody was opposed to it. There was still some support. It just needed a lot more of it. 3 of the 4 assemblymen in Sacramento district voted against it. 1 did vote for it. During the same session, Sacramento State Senator Curtis presented in the Senate a resolution to encourage women to take on more jobs in state agencies, to kind of encourage the employment of more women. But he made sure that he also stated, quote, "Women's proper sphere is to raise and educate her children." He said he was not in favor of the progressive movement or of female suffrage. So he made sure everybody knows I'm supporting women, but only so far. And soon after this legislative session, you have the formation of the first state suffrage association, which was in January 1870. And then in early February of 1870, Sacramento gets its first women's suffrage association. And they held their meeting at Turner Hall and then at Pioneer Hall. And Mrs. Mary S.B. Lewis was its president. She was a teacher and former principal of women's seminary. And the Sacramento Bee sent a reporter to this first meeting and did a multi-page spread on it. They were very interested in what this was going to be like. Most of their coverage of it dealt with how pleasing everybody appeared. They thought they would be all of these, shriveled up old ladies wanting suffrage, and it was, more attractive people than they thought. They described Mrs. Mary S.B. Lewis, the president, as, quote, "a great rarity, an intellectual blonde." And she was actually a member of the Ladies Physiological Institute. This is an interesting one at the time. A part of the women's movement was to get women more interested in physical health, physical fitness, which up until that point, they didn't give any time to. And so the purpose of the Physiological Association was to provide a deeper insight into hygiene and the laws of health and less knowledge of French verbs or Italian idioms. And so they said of this first meeting, and so that was another group that Lewis was a member of. They said of the first meeting of the Suffrage Association that one could not wish to see a prettier, more interesting party than that which meets once a week in Pioneer Hall, than those ladies who assemble to give their voice to their earnest convictions in regard to the necessity of women living a purer, nobler life, occupying a more elevated station in the scale of human being than she is now permitted. And so they held weekly meetings. And this was early on, as they started to argue for women's suffrage. A lot of that argument was couched in terms of women being morally superior, civilizing influence, that their sphere of influence within the home, this, you know, in charge of the children and in charge of, you know, moral interests, that could be expanded to purify politics. And so that was kind of the movement there at the time. That's how that argument was made. And this kind of momentum continued. A women's suffrage convention met across several days. They held a several-day event in December 1871, and Susan B. Anthony delivered several addresses at the Congressional Church here in Sacramento. She, along with a lot of other suffragists, just went on grueling lecture circuits around the whole country. And Sacramento, as the capital of the state of California, was the place to go to talk about women's suffrage. In California, it was either San Francisco or Sacramento. San Francisco, because it just plain had the biggest population by far at the time. So as this was happening, as the early suffrage associations are starting to meet, you also have women gaining some rights in other areas. So as the suffrage question is kind of unanswered, you have these other things going on. You get married women gaining the right to separate economy, trade license, control over their own earnings. This happens in 1872. The UC system first opened its doors to women in 1870. So there's kind of a lull in women's suffrage efforts, you know, in 1870s, as they're trying to unify more at the state level. There's a lot of fracturing, different groups. They're trying to join together and really push for the vote. So another big transition point, in 1879, the state constitution of California was amended. And they said that a person may not be disqualified from entering or pursuing a business, profession, vocation, or employment because of sex, race, creed, color, or national or ethnic origin. And because of that, then women start to say, you know, could this extend to politics? And there were a lot of challenges to that and questions about, are there any sort of political positions that women can hold, and how can we make this work? That same year, a women's suffrage group reformed in the city. They canvassed the city to register women to support suffrage. And at this point, they were getting a bit impatient. So the leader, Mrs. G.W. Towle, said, "Too much talk, too little action already. Now's not the time for speeches. What is needed is the individual labor of women from the homes of Sacramento." I've mentioned congregational church a lot. That was a real center of political activity in Sacramento. So two big places you would go for lobbying and kind of gathering to talk about, you know, as we enter the 1900s, progressive issues was Congregational Church and Hotel Sacramento, which was just a block away from the Capitol. And the Congregational Church included, of course, a lecture room. Public lectures and debates were a big source of entertainment and education at the time. And even if you completely disagreed with Susan B. Anthony and you hated her, you wanted to go hear her talk, and it would kind of give you conversation for the rest of the week. So people would go, whether they agreed or not, to hear people speak. And we drew a lot of very famous people to Sacramento at the time because there was this culture of like going to public lectures, going to debates. And that was the primary way that suffragists were spreading the message and trying to change people's thoughts on suffrage, was by going on these lecture circuits, giving talks all over the country. And we had the new railroad built, Transcontinental Railroad. So they're getting on the train and they're going all around the country to talk, and then hoping that at the local level, their talk will inspire people to form a club and be part of this and then go out themselves. So as this is going on, and again, I'm focusing more at the state level, and I'll go back when I get to talk about the 19th Amendment to what was happening at this time for that. In 1892, there's a proposition that was passed at the state level, Proposition 3, passed by a wide margin, and it required an educational requirement for voters. So you had to be able to write in English, and you had to be able to read a section of the Constitution in English. And I guess this was another step to try to limit voting rights for those who were not native to the US. And in 1893, a bill was brought before the legislature to expand voting rights and holding offices into educational areas for women, which would happen later on before the larger suffrage question was answered. So that was brought in 1893, passed by the legislature, vetoed by the governor. So that would have been our first taste of real suffrage at the state level, but the governor just vetoed that. And at the same time, a Sacramento legislator named Freeman, he presented a petition to the legislature from the women of Woodland. And they petitioned him, they said, could you please form a special committee on suffrage? And he said he did so knowing full well that he was not a particular advocate of women's suffrage. So even though, and this is a story that happens over and over, women would, their clubs would lobby, their clubs would petition the state legislature, and even though their representative may not agree with suffrage, they would present these petitions and present these things to Congress, which was nice. But the resolution was adopted. They formed the committee, and they did grant, and I mentioned that was vetoed, though, that they couldn't vote in the school district, and so nothing came of it. There was another bill brought by referendum, Amendment 4 in 1896. And this was full women's suffrage at the state level. Sacramento voted no. They voted 4,535 to 3,023. So not overwhelming, but they did vote no. And this was supported at the time, support for women's suffrage came from rural counties and from Southern California as LA started to gain in population. It was very much opposed. The main opposition for suffrage throughout this process was San Francisco. San Francisco County, Alameda County, Bay Area definitely was opposed to suffrage, generally for two reasons. One is that the higher income ladies were opposed to suffrage because they already had some sort of political power. They were worried that those, in lower classes would gain equal political power. And then there were also a stronger union presence in the Bay Area, which early on, they were more supportive of, and working women they were more supportive of liquor interests. And those were something that, because the suffrage movement kind of aligned with temperance in a lot of ways, they were not going to vote for it, because you give the women the vote, they're going to make us, so they're going to get rid of all the saloons, basically. And so San Francisco was always opposed to it. And, there were a lot of assemblymen and senators in the Bay Area who had direct or indirect connections to the liquor interests also over there. So Sacramento is the capital of California. And because of that, every legislative session, suffragists descend on the Capitol and they set up shop in the Hotel Sacramento. And famous suffragists from all over the country, including Susan B. Anthony again in 1896, they come to Sacramento and they make appearances. And in 1896, she spoke at the Metropolitan Theater, and she talked about how the Founding Fathers had created a republic had not created a republic, really, but rather a white male aristocracy, because initially you have the barrier of money, then the barrier of race, and then finally gender as being the final barrier to universal suffrage. And so they keep coming, they keep trying. Again, in 1907, they come to Sacramento. This time, it was introduced by Sacramento Assemblyman Grove L. Johnson. He was actually the father of Hiram Johnson. And Hiram Johnson being Sacramento local governor. And his father was elected the head of the suffrage effort, informally in Sacramento. And so he presented suffrage measures several times to the state legislature. And he said in 1909 that he had been opposed to women's suffrage, but he thinks maybe it should be brought to a vote. And he said, "We are not discussing this from a sentimental point of view. It is merely an effort to apply the principle that people should rule. Should we compel one half of the people to submit to the rule of the other half?" And in response, a legislator from San Francisco argued, quote, "I do not believe that our wives, our mothers, and our sisters wish, nor should they have the privilege of rubbing elbows at the polls with depraved women and dope fiends." So that's the biggest argument at the time for the anti-suffrage cause, which was comparatively much smaller, was that women did not want the vote. This was never surveyed, but they just informally, women just did not want to vote. This brings us up to 1911. This is the big year for California, in which we did, in fact, spoiler alert, pass a suffrage amendment at the state level. So at this point, Southern California, LA, has grown in population, and the rural counties are voting. And because of that, because actually Los Angeles had added 90,000 more residents, and there's more industrialization, more women in jobs. All of this means there's really good momentum coming into a vote. In anticipation of this, suffragists from throughout the state came to Hotel Sacramento. And I've mentioned this place. It was a beautiful five-story hotel, and it was at the corner of 10th and K. Beautiful hotel, just a block from the Capitol. And this included both suffragists and anti-suffragists came. So the most prominent anti-suffragist did come to Sacramento. Her name was Mrs. Minnie Bronson. She came via LA. She actually came aboard the same train as the most prominent suffragists were coming. So they all came together. And she campaigned for the Political Equality League. Wait, no, that was the other people that came and began work. And she said that she had a lot of substantiating data, that arithmetical proofs that the majority of women did not wish to vote. She was general secretary for the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, and she did a lot of work for many decades. So they, incidentally, their group, though, chose not to make any efforts in really lobbying because they didn't think that was appropriate. So that helped a little bit for the movement, for the suffrage movement. And to kind of give you an idea of the politics at the time that are allowing suffrage to move forward, is that the suffrage movement found itself through the progressive Republican movement at the time in the early 1900s, and also a little bit through the socialist movement, although there were far fewer socialist voters at the time. And so the Republican Party was the party of choice for white upper middle class club women. Okay, so this is women who are joining your women's council clubs and other things, and then you're also getting some votes from union women as well. They never really, they were at odds on a lot of topics, so this was not something where, this was kind of an uneasy thing, and in a lot of cases they were working toward the same goal, you know, in parallel. That they found it hard to bridge that, the divide. The Lincoln Roosevelt Republican League was an anti-railroad, because the railroads had strong political influence in Sacramento at the time. So it was an anti-railroad, pro-suffrage movement. And they got their first victory in the state of California with the election of Sacramento's mayor, Clinton L. White, in 1908. And at the same time, I had mentioned liquor interests and temperance, and I want to talk briefly about the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So this was a huge group in terms of pushing forward the suffrage question. And so in 1909, Lillian Huff, who ended up being very prominent in the suffrage movement in Sacramento, she was like very high up in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU. I don't know which was faster to say, in the state of California. And she went to the Congress of Reform in Berkeley. And under the auspices of the group, she gave a talk. And she said that in addition to slavery, to king alcohol, society was set back by the unequal relation between man and woman today as a primary cause of the world's discord. So the reason why prohibition was such an important issue for the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and for a lot of those women who wanted to push for suffrage, is because of two things. First of all, it was largely men who were drinking at the time, and there was the issue of children and women being the subjects of a lot of abuse, domestic violence, things like that. Also saloons, which just, you know, blanketed Sacramento, had a lot of political action happening in back rooms, in saloons. Saloons were social meeting places of men in which women were not permitted. And so you have this real fight against saloons at the time, and it's kind of paired with the progressive or reform movement at the time. So for the WCTU, it wasn't just about prohibition. They had a huge range of political issues. They were pushing for questions of like everything from the workplace, working conditions, red light district stuff, custody of children, and treatment of animals, and all sorts of things. So it was just like this general reform movement. And at the same time, women at the state level, as they're gaining some sort of political influence over time, they're pushing for reforms, minimum wage, which goes in the teens for women and children initially, actually. Big thing about eliminating prostitution and red light districts, giving joint custody of minor children, and anything to boost the status of women and children, basically. And that was considered within the sphere of women's political interest and influence. Their political influence stopped short of the ability to hold public office. And according to a law passed in 1909, women couldn't serve had to be registered to vote in order to serve in political office. And this was the kind of case in California. But it was challenged a lot because women, in fact, at the time, around 24 women served as county school superintendents, which was an elected political office. And women were also permitted in a lot of places to vote on school elections. So it was kind of this area, because women were considered children were certainly within the sphere of what women should be concerned with. They were holding some sort of political influence in terms of schools. And the vote was not this black or white, yes or no thing. Like, do they have suffrage? Do they not have suffrage? There were so many gradations of voting rights, as there are now in many ways. So women could vote in local elections in some places. They could vote in some places on tax issues or on school board positions, as I mentioned, but not have equal suffrage with men in any other area. It's also important to note that women tried to vote. So whether they were pretending to be somebody else or just showed up and tried to vote, they were trying to do it. Many women nationally tried to vote in elections in the 1870s, because after the passage of the 15th Amendment, it did not say that women weren't citizens and couldn't vote. They said that citizens of the US can vote. So they said, hey, that's us. They knew that they would probably be challenged at this, but there were many women, hundreds of women, thousands possibly, who went to the polls, especially in 1872, and cast their votes, which were counted even if they did get in trouble afterward. So, you know, there's this movement and things are happening, and it wasn't this black and white thing like, we get suffrage, we're good to go. There's a lot of things that had to happen on the way. And a court ruling, incidentally, against those women who decided to try to vote in the 1870s. There was a court ruling in 1875 that this federal law did not confer voting rights. The states could kind of lock that down. So now they had to go state by state and just try to get suffrage passed, and which was happening very slowly, primarily in the West. I have this map, but I'm going to try to see what this is. I don't have a date on this map. This will give you an idea, though. So this is around the time of the 19th Amendment, what the suffrage kind of setup was across the country. So you can see, and even as this was gaining over time, the South was always opposed to women's suffrage, primarily because they didn't want Black women voting. And then you have kind of, it's questionable in the Northeast and Midwest, and out West, that's where it was happening the earliest, and it was really moving forward rapidly. So back to Sacramento, we have, and actually, I think I wanted to mention, oh yeah, I'm gonna mention something. I've touched on race a couple times, but I am gonna mention, I'm gonna go into a little more depth just kind of right at the end, because it's something that goes through the whole thing. And and it's kind of an interesting subject for Sacramento. So the most prominent woman in Sacramento suffrage around the time that California gets the vote is Lillian Huff. And she died before national suffrage passed. So she died in 1916, but she built the movement in 1911. It was a big deal for her. She helped establish the women's building at the state fair. She was an active part in the Sacramento Women's Council. She was also very active in the WCTU, president of that locally. And she devoted her life also to, within the WCTU, to helping people with mental health issues and setting up care for people with mental health issues. So that was very important to her as well. So the Sacramento Equal Suffrage League, which she helped found, that met at the Hotel Sacramento, as I've mentioned, that's the place. And in addition to speakers and networking and that sort of stuff, they submitted letters and they petitioned the legislators to pass a suffrage amendment. And as I mentioned, there was strong opposition, even 1911, strong opposition in the Bay Area, but they were going to push for this. So there's a great quote, an article kind of highlighted in the Union, actually, in late August 1911. They said, "Suffragists to invade this city." And so hundreds of suffragists from all over California, especially the Bay Area, they arrived to spread their cause through rallies, luncheons, parlor meetings in homes, kind of a very personal individual level too. And over 500 suffragists from Sacramento got on the train and came over. They were met at Western Pacific Depot at 19th and J. And they connected with the Chamber of Commerce. Sacramento Chamber of Commerce was always very much in support of the suffrage movement because it brought people to Sacramento. So while they're here, let's get them excited about the city. And they drove an auto parade through Sacramento. And this is around the time also of the state fair. Big opportunity as people come throughout the state to talk about women's suffrage. So the suffragists held an event in Oak Park to mark the opening of the state fair. They had over 2,500 people in attendance. And the Glenn Andrus, who was the secretary of the Chamber of Commerce, he opened the event with his support. He says, "In equal suffrage lies the salvation of politics." And again, you hear that echo of women being kind of the civilizing influence, and that they're going to, you know, elevate politics above kind of this gritty backroom, just dirty thing that they were worried women would be tainted by, of course, earlier on. And Oak Park businessmen ceremonially buried a hatchet. They called it Women's Day for the state fair, the opening day. And there was a tent at the state fair that they held. This is 1911. So this is actually also the year that Oak Park is annexed by the city of Sacramento. And a lot of the suffrage movement is happening within Oak Park area, interestingly, in 1911 and into 1912. That's where a lot of the movement's happening. So you get speakers at the state fair from San Francisco, from Sacramento, and you also have the head of the statewide suffrage association coming to talk about suffrage. And the vote happens on Proposition 4 for suffrage on October 11th, 1911. And at first, because most of the votes in support were coming from rural places, they thought it did not pass. So it was one of these like Truman Dewey things where they held up the newspapers the next day and said, didn't pass. They were celebrating in San Francisco. So it's fantastic. It didn't happen. The votes from the rural counties start to roll in and roll in and roll in. And it became clear that it was going to pass. So it did pass, and they announced that on October 12th. I think I have like a nice little slide here to show you the change in Sacramento. So we have 1896, you've got pretty good margin against suffrage in Sacramento for the 1896 vote. These were the two big ones. And in 1911, it squeaks by, and in Sacramento, we did pass it. The only counties I can think of that had a big margin not passing it, San Francisco, Alameda, and interestingly, Orange County were the three where it just did not do well. But a lot of other counties, those were the big population centers. So everything else was pretty rural at the time. A lot of other counties did vote in support of suffrage. And then we have actually going to go back to here because I want to talk about what happens now. So California women now have the ability to vote in the state of California. And we were now the 6th state to pass suffrage. So we did it pretty early on. And now they face the challenge of how do you register to vote? So the first 5 women attempted to register to vote at the county clerk's office in Sacramento on October 15th. And Lillian Huff was among them. And the county clerk fund was his name. He failed to let them know, although then reported to the SACB Union, that their applications wouldn't really be accepted because they weren't sure that all the votes had come in, and also because they were just going to have to re-register in the new year. So obviously not really understanding how symbolic and important this was for them to register to vote, he said, you know what, I'm just going to throw them out anyway. But this kept happening when a group of women from Galt came and they said, we're ready to register to vote. And he said the same thing. He said, no, you're gonna have to vote. Well, by a couple weeks later, he was registering women to vote. So Minnie Grace Crowell was the first woman to vote, register to vote in Sacramento County. And she registered alongside 32 other women. And the majority registered Republican because, as I had mentioned, the progressive movement within that was very pro-suffrage. And the Republican Party had actually added suffrage to its platform in the late 1800s as part of its cause, because the majority of the Democrats, of course, were concentrated in the South and were very opposed to women's suffrage. So now registration teas were held in the late winter and spring of 1912. So women early on registering to vote were registering in homes any way they could that was convenient for them. Initially, they had to check for height. Initially, they said you have to tell your exact age, but then decided they thought women wouldn't want to do that. And so they said you don't have to give your age. And they were concerned about the hat issue with the height. It actually turned out okay. And they said you just have to be over 21. Say you're over 21. So they started holding these registration teas in homes, and they were kind of made fun of by a lot of other groups. And they said, well, you're holding a tea to register to vote. It's so feminine or something. So Lillian Huff said, supposing it is a man's choice and custom to do politics in the back room of a saloon or any other place he likes, let him do so. But if a woman prefers the pink tea, the church parlor, or a such place, just please let her follow her own will in such matters. So she registered a lot of people in the Oak Park area in homes, and the newspapers reported on it, primarily focusing on the anti-saloon issue, that women were registering to vote, and this meant something's going to happen to those saloons. At the time, Oak Park was exploring the idea of kind of building up its Whiskey Row, which had kind of gone away over time, and opening up more saloons. And so the union said that the women were more concerned with banishing saloons from the neighborhood than voting on commissioners. And in some cases that was the case. In a lot of cases it was not. They simply wanted to vote, obviously. Mrs. Huff, and I've talked a bit about her, she called herself an emancipated woman. And she, in 1911, had threatened to run against Luella Johnston. If any of you know, she was the first woman elected to a political office in California, just around the time that women were able to vote in 1911. And she was voted, speaking on Luella Johnston, first woman elected to city council. At the time, it was city commission in Sacramento. And she joined it as the Commissioner of Education, which again was a role that was seen as more appropriate for women, covering educational matters for the city of Sacramento. The oldest woman to register was Mrs. Mary Elizabeth Thompson. She was in her late 80s, and she was quoted in the Boye as saying, really, I don't care what my politics are, and I don't know what my politics are, I don't care very much, but I want to cast a vote against the reopening of the saloons in Oak Park. So she was a very anti-saloon woman. And again, there was a new ordinance to turn the main street of Oak Park into Whiskey Row. So she did not want that. And she had registered in the home of Mrs. A.H. Brown on Orange Avenue. Young black men of Sacramento formed a young men's forum in February of 1912, had their first meeting at St. Andrew Baptist Church to discuss, quote, the importance of the use of the ballot by women. And at that meeting, a lot of local women were registered to vote. So it's everybody's trying to get out and register to vote. But again, it's in homes, it's a very informal kind of way, and at meetings and stuff like that. Turns out women actually did want to vote. So 11,000 women registered to vote in Sacramento County for the election in 1912, 16,000 men. So a good number of women managed to register to vote before that next election. An increasing number did over time, of course. So now women have the vote in 1912. And what do they do with it in Sacramento? Well, first of all, they're turning their efforts to the national movement, national suffrage. They want to help all of these other states get suffrage passed as well. And they also want to look at a national amendment. They also, that's one thing, they also want to begin to push their political power and flex those muscles. So the Women's Legislative Council set up shop at the Hotel Sacramento for the whole 1913 legislative session. And they were supposed to be, they educated women on different policy issues, upcoming bills and stuff like that, but they also were a real strong lobbying body. So they left a card on the seat of every legislator's seat and said, this is the first legislative platform of the Women's Legislative Council. And they had 17 proposed bills on there. And there were also a lot of demonstrations at the state level happening around this time to try to build momentum and to help out women nationally. So you have the Panama Pacific International Exposition in 1915 in San Francisco. And they had a huge rally there featuring speakers from every enfranchised state and country in the world. So you have representatives from California, you also have people from China, Denmark, every other country where women have the vote came and talked about what that was like and kind of encouraged others. And in 1916, as we're moving forward, prominent suffragists met in Sacramento to help form the first branch of the National Women's Party in the West. And this is the group that's really going for national suffrage, passing the 19th Amendment. And their basic intention when they were formed in 1916 was to oppose Woodrow Wilson. He had spoken in opposition to suffrage at the national level, and so they were hoping to get him out of office. Locally, women were talking about, and I'll just do this one here, the passage of the amendment as an emergency wartime measure, that women were out there doing men's jobs during the war. They were, holding much more prominent places because they were doing the work of men at home. They were heading households. They needed political rights. And so it was, at this time, the World War I happening was actually something that really moved suffrage forward more quickly, right? And now you also have this momentum going where women can vote at the state level in the majority of the states. Now it's all over the West, and now it's spreading in the East. And so you're getting enough people that it's possible to, do something. And then we have the expansion of the political rights and influence of women, just as it had happened in the 1870s. Now you've got women, suffrage at the state level, also holding political office happened in conjunction with that. So you have in 1918, 4 women elected to the state legislature in California, very, very shortly after suffrage passed. And then you also have the ability to serve on a jury. There's a lot of these other political gains that aren't just suffrage that are happening in the teens and had been happening since the 1870s. And now you also have women in Sacramento and nationally getting more reception, received more favorably by groups to give talks. There was this woman came from Austin, Texas, Clara Snell Wolf, to Sacramento in May 1916, and the Rotary hosted her. And she talked about suffrage right before Lou Brayton shared about the hide and shoe business. So you have like these women who before, maybe, Susan B. Anthony comes, she gives a talk on suffrage. Now you've got women come in regularly giving talks for a whole variety of people about suffrage, and people were so much more open to the idea of it. You also have, as I mentioned, more of an increase in the voting population in places where it's more open to suffrage. The West is growing, and the Bay Area opposition is there, but it's in decline. And again, you have the fears of prohibition, but in the end, the 18th Amendment, the Prohibition Amendment, did pass by men. So that happened without women gaining the vote yet. So that's something important to note there, that it wasn't simply, and it was, prohibition was something that was passed in other countries as well. It was not restricted to the United States, certainly, and it was a movement that was happening more generally at the time. So that all kind of, even though there was some opposition from those other things, they were declining in importance at the time by 1919. So now I want to talk about the 19th Amendment and its California origins, which are very interesting. So one of the first suffrage groups in California was formed in Nevada City area, Nevada County, in 1869 by Ellen Clark Sargent. And she had met teaching Sunday school and married Aaron A. Sargent. He ended up, both of them, they came to California, they settled in Nevada City, and then he became he rose politically very rapidly and ended up being a senator in Congress. And he actually presented the amendment to, or not the amendment, he presented the Pacific Railroad Act. So he was the one that got going the Transcontinental Railroad, and, he had a locomotive named after him. It was all very exciting, but he was a pretty influential person at the time in the West, and he was a Nevada City guy. And he and his wife, Ellen Clark Sargent, she had formed that first suffrage association in Nevada City. She was also a very politically prominent person in the suffrage movement in California. And she was a mover and shaker, and she was very motivated. And she and her husband met up with Susan B. Anthony aboard a train crossing the US on her lecture circuit. And they spent several days with her. They got snowed in a couple places. And so they spent a lot of time with Susan B. Anthony, and they were talking about suffrage. And on this multi-day train ride, they actually worked out text for, this is in 1871, they worked out text for an amendment to the Constitution that would allow suffrage to pass at the national level. So it was a very important train ride. And it took a few years, though. They had this in mind, and he really wanted to do something about it, and Ellen Clark Sargent was pushing for it, but it needed momentum, and they especially talked about the importance of unifying all those suffrage organizations so that it's possible for something like this to happen. And finally, in 1878, the amendment was presented, January 1878, and the text of it, the 19th Amendment, reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." 1878, he presents this. They say, let's put it in committee, where it remains all the way until 1887. So this is 9 years in committee, and then it was finally rejected by the Senate, a vote of 16 to 34. So not really promising. And this is in 1887. Here's the amazing thing. Women, suffragists at the time, they have this setback. A lot of people don't realize this. They went to Congress and presented this amendment every year up until 1919 when it was approved. So this was not something where it was presented back in the day. It was called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. It wasn't presented, and then there was a break of time. Every year that Congress went into session, women descended upon DC and lobbied and pushed and tried to get a suffrage amendment passed. So they kept fighting for this. And women from all over the country would go over there. So by 1919, you have that National Women's Party who's formed, Sacramento as well, to try to help out for the national cause. And at this point, a lot of states have suffrage at the state level. And so the story of the final passage, the ratification of it, I should say, by Tennessee on August 18th, 1920, is a nail biter and is a great story. So I would recommend looking into that. But basically, it did come down to the last state. So it wasn't something where they were on the way. Many other states could have voted for ratification. It was like it was Tennessee or nothing. They had to pass it. It passed, and a lot of the states early on that rejected it, apart from Delaware, all the states that rejected it were located in the South. And so when it passed in June 1919, though, locally, the Women's Christian Temperance Union requested that Governor Stevens, it was Governor William Stevens at the time in California, they said, please, let's get a special session going. We want to vote to ratify this amendment. And it took a while. So it was June 1919, and they were asking for this. And he said, yes, he's going to call a special session in California to vote on ratification. And he really wanted it to be the only item on the agenda. He didn't want anything else talked about. He wanted to like showcase, we're going to vote for ratification. That was not what happened. So what happened is he called a special session for early November 1919. And State Senator J.M. Inman of Sacramento used the opportunity to push for several measures against Japanese settlement in the state. The issue of Japanese settlement and immigration in California was like at a fever pitch in the 20s, and especially in Sacramento with the Delta. This was just very important to them. So at the same time that you have us talking about giving the vote to women, you have us spending the majority of the time, it turns out, at that session talking about how we can deny citizenship to other people. So it was a really interesting juxtaposition. On the day of the vote, that was November 1st, 1919, actually November 2nd, but the day before, women of the California Suffrage Ratification Committee of the National American Women's Suffrage, so that's so many things. National American Women's Suffrage Association, they hosted the governor and his wife at the Hotel Sacramento. And then afterward, they headed over as a group to witness discussion and hopefully ratification of the amendment. And they also had in session those 4 women I had mentioned who were elected to the state legislature in 1918. They also spoke, and they were very excited, and they were there as well. So ratification itself had no opposition at that point in California, so it passed very easily. Almost no resistance. I believe there were 2 that opposed it. But the vast majority were in support, and so there was no issue about it. It was the 18th state, so we were in the middle of the pack. We were halfway there to full ratification. There had to be 36 states because there were 48 at the time, and that was how the numbers came out. So full ratification, I mentioned, came with Tennessee in August of 1920. And Sacramento, at that point, we had a huge population of women voting in Sacramento, signed up, ready to vote, and they voted. The first election was the 1920 presidential election, and there were 25,000 people registered to vote in Sacramento. Actually, more than that. 24,000 voted in the presidential election, but way more registered, although a higher majority voted back then than they do today. So that's kind of the overview that I do want to, like I had mentioned earlier, talk briefly about the question of race and voting in California. So around the time that there was a question of voting in 1870, again, there were very few Black women living in California. So that was not a question for the state of California. They were far fewer than 1% of the population. But the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had barred Chinese from citizenship in the US. And those racial barriers to citizenship were not lifted until 1952. So if you were first generation Asian immigrant to California, you were not a citizen and you were not able to vote. And so you don't have Asian citizens of California really until later on. And the Chinese Exclusion Act, incidentally, was renewed all the way up until 1943. Assemblyman J.W. Johnston at the 1919 ratification vote, some people had brought up the question of, like the 2 guys who voted against it, had said if the South, they're worried over there that if they allow people to vote, they will have a large, a proportion of the population of uneducated African Americans voting, and they didn't want that, right? And so J.W. Johnston, the assemblyman from Sacramento, said if the South was worried about millions of uneducated Black women joining the voter rolls, they should build more schools, is what they should do. And so that's kind of the Sacramento response to that in 1919. And again, it passed without really any opposition. But so that's kind of that picture, is that in Sacramento, you've got kind of a lot of people voting. And again, this is not a black and white thing. They get the vote at the national level, but there were so many other obstacles over time to voting, you know, both imposed and self-imposed. And it's an ongoing question and an ongoing topic. And looking into all of this just brings up so many issues that are pertinent today. It also makes you realize how important the vote is and how much work went into obtaining the voting rights that we do have, and how important it is to exercise them and appreciate them. And the story of the Sacramento side is really one of just a lot of patience and persistence, political savvy, and also realizing that even when there's fractured groups working toward the same thing, you can come together and make something happen. It took decades, but it did happen. It was sort of inevitable, and it was something that they had to work really hard for, but they also had to just come together and realize it was going to be a long haul. So it's a really interesting topic, especially in terms of Sacramento's side of things. That's what I have. I am ready to take questions.
Make sure to unmute yourselves, everyone, if you want to ask just over Zoom. You can also send in questions via chat.
Yeah.
And it looks like we've got a question from Vicky in chat.
Oh. How many California women voted in 1920? I want to see if I have that. I remember it was, let's see if I have that. I don't have that, but as I recall, it was fairly 50-50 in terms of gender for that election. An interesting thing is they didn't at the time have polls like we do today, but they held a poll, an informal poll that was held like in movie theaters. They'd give everybody a survey and you'd say, you know, who am I going to vote for and everything like that. And then if you subscribed to the Literary Digest, you got to see who was favored for the presidential election. And through that, they knew that it was pretty 50-50 in terms of women who were going to be voting in the election. There were 25,000 were registered Republican, 9,000 were Democrat, and then just a smattering of other political parties.
Let's see. Hey, Amanda, I've got a question for you with regard to your sources. So you gave us kind of an audio annotated bibliography at the beginning of your talk. Do you have those written down anywhere?
I don't. I can write them down.
Okay. So I think what we're going to do is this. I know some people are interested in sort of the path you took to come up with this awesome presentation. And I'm going to post my email address, and I will, if you contact me, I will push that bibliography that Amanda is just going to whip together in the next week or so out to you. Does that sound pretty good to everybody?
A lot of thumbs up.
All right, yeah.
I do want to mention, though, a lot of the images I used in the PowerPoint, and I'll put this in that list, but were from Calisphere, the state library, and others have great collection of both pro and anti-suffrage ephemera from the period of the 19th Amendment. So, and a lot of it's also from 1911, and it's very entertaining, very interesting stuff, and it's a very rich collection. That's just freely viewable online, but that's really where I got the bulk of the images that I have in the presentation.
Okay, any other questions? I can't believe we don't have any other questions. So, well, here's a question I think we can all address. So, the Progressive Party, capital P, Progressive Party, at the turn of the century, they've always confused me because, they believed in workers' rights, and they, supported suffrage causes and green spaces and city beautiful. And yet it was so dreadfully racist.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I've just, you used the term juxtaposition.
Yeah.
Um, can you add anything more to that?
It's an interesting question. It's like, I think what happened is that, and even at the national level, so you have a lot of the early suffragists were abolitionists. They were part of the Underground Railroad, and they were very much part of that movement. But political expediency became an issue later on with the suffrage movement in terms of how much women of color were able to join the movement and be a part of it. You have women wanting to march, or a lot of African American suffrage groups, women's groups down in the South and a lot of other places who were not permitted to be fully part of the movement because there was this worry about alienating people. So in some ways, I think that, the suffrage movement became part of the progressive reform and all of that. But I think that it's, in California especially, a big part of that was, as a popular movement, kind of playing into people's, at the time, worries and prejudices in California. And that was definitely a big part. And in Sacramento, that was kind of the center of a lot of the anti-Japanese sentiment in California, especially in the teens and 20s. It was crazy. And yeah, like I said, at the session in 1919, they spent almost all of the time talking about that issue and not talking about suffrage. So it is interesting. Yeah.
Because I know the McClatchys were also, Republican or Democrats slash progressives, but also this awful blind spot with Asian Americans.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have an inquiry from one of our viewers. Was hoping you could go back and talk a bit about the St. Andrews AME.
Yeah, I don't have a lot about I mentioned the group very briefly. So in terms of church groups, different denominations and their support of suffrage, because women did a lot of political action through churches at the time and organization. Congregational churches, Society of Friends, Quaker churches were very in support of suffrage, and Methodist. So those denominations were the ones through which a lot of this was happening. And actually, I don't think I mentioned, so one of the members locally of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who was very much big into suffrage, was the Reverend Mary M. Bowen, and she was the first woman ordained as a minister in the Methodist Episcopal Church. And she was a strong supporter of the Japanese community in Sacramento. So she had very close ties to that community in Sacramento. So churches were big centers of political movement at the time, especially for the topic of suffrage, and especially those denominations. I don't have a lot else about that group, though. It sounded very interesting.
And Amanda, it looks like you've got a few other questions here. It looks like,
yeah. So Bay Area, when did it become more liberal, and did women have a lot to do with that? I don't think so. The women we're talking about in the Bay Area who weren't liberal were San Francisco had a lot of society women, club women back in that period. I guess I'm not sure on when it became that much more liberal. Probably just tipping the scales demographically in terms of the residents there in the Bay Area. At the time, San Francisco was like the cultural center of California. Those were the wealthy, the cultured. You were in San Francisco, and I think as that changes, I'm sure that that had to have some impact on it. What did the connection between suffrage and prohibition turn out to be in California and Sacramento? Basically, if you were an advocate of prohibition, generally there's huge overlap with being pro-suffrage. And in Sacramento, it was such a wet city with a lot of liquor interests that, but not as much as San Francisco, that it's actually very impressive that they still managed to pass, in 1911, voted in favor of women's suffrage locally, because that was such a strong thing in the area. And again, it was just because prohibition was seen as a pro-women movement, and also because the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which at that time had hundreds of thousands of members at the national level, was all about getting the vote, because they figured if you can get the vote, we can push all these reforms. So there's huge overlap there. Yeah. Did I answer the questions? Am I seeing any that I don't?
Yeah, and then it looks like we've got a really nice note down at the bottom from Julia.
Yeah.
With regard to the centennial, so that's pretty terrific.
Yeah. That sounds great.
So again, if you have any questions that you need me to get to Amanda, I can do that. You can email me, and I can contact her as well. Any other questions, everybody?
I see a silent clapping. Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, Amanda, thank you so much. What a great presentation.